Okay, moving into satellite imagery. We've got a pretty good low pressure area, another one here, right over Kodiak Island today. And so conditions pretty showery there on and off with a few clearing periods there. And the front pushing up into the North Gulf Coast with snow, blowing snow into Prince William Sound there and the northern Kenai Peninsula, main moisture band lifting northward here. So drying out a little bit over the southern Kenai Peninsula today. And some scattered clouds over the southern interior to mostly clear skies up over the northeast part of the state on up to the North Slope. End of the Arctic coast is that area clouds lifts northward. As you can see, moving off the coast to the north there, some clouds spreading northwestward, and then good northwest flow here coming down across the Bering Sea. And with snow showers, snow Pribilofs into the Alaska Peninsula, snow today in the Bristol Bay area as well. And rain on the increase here, Yakutat, rain and snow, and rain on the increase for the northern coast of the Panhandle. Actually, along the entire coast as that front begins to push inland. And you can see gradually moving eastward here, and also the moisture coming northward and out to the west. Next system out here over the Russian Far East will be actually developing with some very cold air coming down, and that'll develop a system that'll move into the southwest coast and bring another round of some actually low pressure right here. Very cold air coming down out of the Russian Far East, but that'll be tracking eastward, and it'll bring snow and blowing snow into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta area when it makes landfall on the southwest coast. Otherwise, today we had the low here with the 30 to 55 mile an hour wind gusts out of the northwest here across the Alaska Peninsula, more northerly there in Bristol Bay. Narrow band of some light snow showers here over the western interior. Otherwise, mostly cloudy with a few isolated snow showers in the clouds here over the central interior, but see some pretty good clearing there north of the eastern Alaska Range on up into the northern interior, all the way out to the Arctic coast. And precipitation on the increase here over the Panhandle for tonight. Look for rain with snow at the higher elevations and rain or rain and snow mix for the North Gulf Coast, but that'll be snow inland areas. Obviously into the coast range there, Prince William Sound. Better chance of snow here across south central Alaska, and a pretty good area of light snow will extend northwestward all the way up with some snow showers along the northwest coast, Kotzebue Sound area, southern slopes of the western Brooks Range. A break here over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta with some higher pressure building in, and with that ridging and the low pulling eastward here, look for those northwest winds. Could see some gusts 40 to 50 miles an hour there in the channeled areas of Kodiak Island overnight tonight, but that won't last too long. And then this next developing system here spreading snow back into the Pribilofs. Otherwise, just some scattered snow or rain showers over the Aleutians. Not too bad there with fairly light winds. And then for tomorrow, that low tracks right into the southwest coast on Thursday here with snow and blowing snow in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta areas. Lowest conditions along the coast, several inches snow falling there with winds gusting anywhere from 25, maybe as high as 40 miles an hour or so. And snow will spread into the Bristol Bay area with this warm front and into the Kuskokwim Valley, right up to the western Alaska Range. Some lingering slight snows up over the northwest part of the state there. And some of that extending down, probably be really more mist than hit here under the ridge axis. Chance of slight snow areas of the Copper River Basin. Periods of rain continue there in the Panhandle. And then for Friday, a trough moving through the southeast coast will keep it kind of unsettled and showery there. Low pressure tracks up right into Prince William Sound. Colder air coming in from the west here. That low center actually tracking eastward to this position after it lands on the southwest coast tomorrow and tomorrow night, coming across the southwest interior. And by the afternoon Friday, will be in this location. And that's a pretty good setup for some snow to come across all areas of south central Alaska with those northerly winds. Colder air coming in again with that. To a lesser extent, Kodiak Island, areas of snow, possible central eastern interior, but amounts on the light side. Big storm way out here to the west and a good push of southwest flow bringing warmer air back into the western and central Bering Sea, and that'll help develop this ridge axis, which will make a pretty good weekend over interior Alaska here. Well, it'll take until probably sometime in the weekend that this system will start affecting the northwest part of the state there, Yukon Delta Coast Bering Strait area. Otherwise, for lows tonight, in the 30s for the Panhandle and teens and 20s elsewhere over south central Alaska, followed by highs 40s southeast coast, 35 to 40 here east and south of the Alaska Range, in the 20s to the west, followed by lows, single numbers, Kuskokwim Valley. Again, colder air coming in, so 15 to 20 for the Susitna Valley, lower 20s, lower to mid-20s, Kenai Peninsula, in the 30s again for the Panhandle, followed by highs, lower 40s, lower to mid-40s, southeast coast, mid-30s, Copper River Basin, and lower to mid-30s, south central Alaska, 15 to 20 in the Kuskokwim Valley. Up to the north, lows tonight, mostly above zero everywhere. Highs tomorrow, right around freezing here over toward Fairbanks, otherwise in the 20s, cooling into the teens, but 10 to 15 for the Arctic coast, followed by lows. A little bit below zero, anywhere from 5 to 10 below Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island, up to the western Arctic coast. Milder here in the east, 5 to 15 for the lows. Highs 20 to 25 eastern interior, 5 to 10 back out toward the Seward Peninsula area, and for the southwest coast tonight, lows around 8 degrees, mid-20s for the Pribilos, lower to mid-30s for the Aleutians, and upper 20s for the Alaska Peninsula. Highs 35 to 40 in the Aleutians, 30 to 35 for the Pribilos, followed by lows Friday morning, mid-20s for St. Paul and St. George, lower 30s, lower to mid-30s for the Aleutians, and still pretty chilly here along the southwest coast, especially the Yukon Delta coast, down to around 5 to 10, followed by highs, upper 30s to lower 40s, mid-30s for the Pribilof Islands.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
I'm meteorologist Emily. Thank you for joining us on our aviation segment of our broadcast. First, we're going to be looking at your Thursday morning flying conditions. You can see we have several weather systems which are going to be bringing IFR conditions. We have that dissipating low in the Gulf of Alaska, which is bringing IFR conditions even as it dissipates and moves to the southeast. We have the second dissipating low in the Chukchi and northern Bristol Bay or northern Bering Sea areas, which is also bringing widespread IFR conditions for your Thursday morning. Then in the Bristol Bay area, we have another low, which is moving towards the Kuskokwim Delta, and it will be bringing IFR conditions. Looking at your Thursday afternoon for your flying weather, again, we have that low and frontal system lingering along the coast of Alaska. We also have in the Bristol Bay area, that low continues to move into the Bristol Bay area. And then up north, we have improving conditions, but still, again, that low is going to be keeping ceilings and your visibilities low. For your Friday morning, we're going to have widespread IFR conditions in valleys in central Alaska, and we're still going to be seeing IFR conditions in the Panhandle due to that frontal and low pressure system. Meanwhile, we are starting to see a low pressure system moving up from the Pacific and bringing deteriorating conditions in the western and central Bering. Friday afternoon, that low continues to move further into the Bering Sea, so be careful flying in those areas. It's a fairly potent system with low visibilities and ceilings. Let's look at your pass conditions. You can see in AKwx Pass, we are going to start it with VFR conditions, but deteriorate to IFR towards your afternoon hours. Aviation Pass is going to be experiencing the same thing as well, with VFR conditions deteriorating towards IFR conditions. Further south in Merrill and Lake Clark passes, we are going to be seeing the opposite, where it starts out in IFR conditions, but improves with VFR conditions towards the afternoon as that low moves further towards the east. At Rainy Pass, we start out with IFR conditions, but improve towards MVFR towards your afternoon. Windy Pass will start with MVFR conditions, but again, improve as well. Isabel Pass, in contrast, will start with MVFR conditions, but will deteriorate towards IFR conditions in the afternoon hours. Mentasta will remain at MVFR. Tahina will remain at IFR throughout your Thursday. Portage will remain at IFR due to that lingering dissipating system in the Gulf of Alaska. Same thing in Chilkoot and White Passes. That frontal system will be staying in the Panhandle for your Thursday. Let's look at your freezing levels. Again, cold air is entrenched across much of the Bering and mainland Alaska. You can see it's mainly temperatures above freezing are staying in the Gulf of Alaska, and you have to go fairly south to even see 2,000 feet for your freezing level. For icing, again, we have those two main systems. We have that low moving into Bristol Bay and Kuskokwim Delta, and we also have that frontal system, which will also be bringing considerable moderate along the Gulf of Alaska coast. Looking at your upper level jets, we have that dissipating low in the Gulf of Alaska, and we have 75 knots aloft and 75 knots aloft in the Gulf of Alaska as well. But as we move further west, we see that system potently moving into the Bering Sea. We're seeing 110 knots aloft. Going at your lower levels, you can see we have a 70-knot jet moving into your Bristol Bay area and Kuskokwim Delta with a low pressure system to the north. And in the Gulf of Alaska, we have 50 to 60 knots associated with that low pressure system. Now as we go to 3,000 feet closer to the surface, we see 55 knots moving into both your Kuskokwim Delta and into your Bristol Bay areas. We also have 55 and 50 knot winds associated with this low-level jet of this dissipating low. Finally, let's take a look at your turbulence forecast. We have isolated moderate in portions of the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, and through some of those local gap areas. Meanwhile, we have considerable moderate along the Alaska Peninsula and into the Kuskokwim Delta areas associated with that low pressure system as it continues to push onshore throughout your Thursday. Meanwhile, we have some lingering considerable moderate turbulence along your Gulf of Alaska coast as this low pressure system moves away, but we still have some low level winds associated with that, which might cause considerable moderate turbulence.
Places on the surface, you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places, you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there, it takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places, like Alaska and Patagonia, that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, Alex uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on into the marine forecasts. For Thursday, south coast here, west winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the north coast, south to southeast winds 15 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, south winds of 15 knots. Stevens Passage winds southeast of 15 knots. And for Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 knots, seas up to 9 feet. And then for the day on Friday, central and southern inner water areas and channels, southeast winds at 10 knots with slight seas, south 15 for Lynn Canal. West-southwest winds here on the south coast at 15 to 20 knots. And for the central coast, southwest winds 20 knots, and the north coast, south winds 20 knots. Prince William Sound, variable to northeast breeze tomorrow at about 10 knots, seas no more than 2 feet. And for the north or eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast winds at 15 knots, but western North Gulf Coast north at 25. And those winds continue to increase up to gale force here over toward the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, west northwesterlies at 40 knots. Southern Cook Inlet, small craft advisories, west winds 25 knots. And then for the day on Friday, no change over Cook Inlet, westerlies 15 to 25 knots, strongest south of the Forelands. Lighter winds there for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, west at 30 knots, seas 8 to 10 feet. Western North Gulf Coast, west winds 25 knots. East side there, west-southwest 15 to 25 knots, and Prince William Sound, west winds 15 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, west winds 30 to 35 knots. Alaska Peninsula, west-southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, southwesterlies at 25. And for the day on Friday, southwest winds and west-southwesterlies at 15 to 20 knots for the peninsula, Alaska Peninsula, and southwest 15 for the Bristol Bay area, Kodiak Island, west winds 20 to 25 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, not too bad. Southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. West-southwest 20 knots for Adak and Atka, seas at about 7 feet. And for the Western Aleutians, west-southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. And for Friday, the next active front coming in will bring definitely gale force, possibly storm force winds with it late in the day to the western Aleutians, south winds 40 to 50 knots. Adak and Atka in the afternoon, south winds increasing to 25 to 30 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians here, southwest winds at 20 knots. And for the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island tomorrow, again, we got that low center tracking right in toward Nunivak Island. So for the Yukon Delta coast, winds will be east at 20 knots, Kuskokwim Delta coast, southwest at 25, west 30 knots for the Pribilofs, 12-foot seas there, northwest 20 for St. Matthew Island, and southwest 10 to 15 knots for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound. And for Friday, south winds 25 knots here for the Yukon, or for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, Yukon Delta coast west at 15, and St. Lawrence Island, southwest winds 15 knots, and 45 knot winds as that next front comes in, mostly west of St. Matthew Island, Pribilof southwest at 30. And for the far eastern Arctic coast tomorrow, brisk wind advisories for east winds 25 knots. Otherwise, the remainder of the coast, east winds at 15 knots in the Chukchi Sea. Kind of variable here around Cape Beaufort to Cape Thompson, but only at 15 knots all the way down to Wales. And then for Friday, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots from Wales to Cape Beaufort, western Arctic coast south at 15, and now west winds in the forecast for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, but only at about 15 knots. And for tonight, low pressure pulling into the Gulf of Alaska there, so that'll dry Kodiak Island out. You'll get a gusty northwest wind situation, maybe up to 40, maybe 50 miles an hour in gusts in the windier areas there. Rain for the Panhandle, snow higher elevations. The rain and snow for the North Gulf Coast, and chance of snow southern Alaska all the way up to the northwest coast. This system comes in with snow and blowing snow into the Kuskokwim and Yukon deltas tomorrow, with snow into Bristol Bay pushing into the Kuskokwim Valley late tomorrow and overnight tomorrow night. That low tracks eastward right over Prince William Sound on Friday. So that's a pretty good chance of maybe several inches of snow coming across south central Alaska. All areas there as cold air sweeps southward once again, but higher pressure building in makes for what possibly could be a pretty good weekend here over interior Alaska. But this storm will push up to the northeast over the weekend and bring stormy conditions to the west and northwest part of the state. Otherwise, for Friday, looks still unsettled for the southeast coast, and out west, pretty good for the Aleutians under high.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.